Hello, everybody. I see a lot of friendly faces coming in from the waiting room. I know that this is a much anticipated event because we not only have internally had to redo a little bit of rescheduling, but externally we were supposed to do this last week. But of course, technology sometimes isn't always the most reliable thing. But hey, you know what? Now we had a whole nother week to get extra prepared. I got a whole nother slew of questions that came in, new people that got to register because of the extra week break. So hopefully that some other new faces that weren't first registered for last week got to make it in this week. But just hello to everybody. My name is Carly Euler. I am the marketing director at MemoryFox. I am so excited for this event because I read this incredible report and it's entitled Philanthropy's New Voice, Building Trust with Deeper Stories and Clear Language. And my colleague Josh sent it to me, must have been the end of last year, maybe like the fall of last year. And we just thought this was such an interesting take on something that I don't think enough people are talking about, and that is kind of a foundation's relationship to storytelling. And of course, here at MemoryFox, we really love to talk a lot about specifically ethical storytelling. So after we read the report, we decided, hey, we got to get in contact with these creators. We got to see if we can get them to do a little event with us. So I am joined by two of the creators of the report today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them, and then they're going to share the biggest takeaways. And then I'm going to go ahead and get those questions that were submitted during registration, and we're going to get some things answered. So, my first guest today is Aaron Zeller. He is the Director of Strategic Communications for the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Intercultural Initiative at Stony Brook University. His expertise centers on building the communication capacity of organizations and foundations on issues ranging from public interest technology, criminal legal reform, and public health. He has built social media and media relations strategies, facilitated trainings and coachings on storytelling and strategic communication, led the communication efforts for a national nonprofit, and researched the effectiveness of adopting a public interest focused approach to communication. Welcome, Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And introducing our next guest is Anne Elizabeth Seawright Cristiano. She's the founder and director of the Center for Public Interest Communications and a clinical professor in the Department of Public Relations at the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications. Seawright developed the first ever curriculum in public interest communications, very impressive, connecting practitioners and scholars who are already working in the field and nurturing and sharing research that can advance this newly emerging academic discipline. She has worked with several federal and state agencies, the Gates Foundation, the International Labor Organization, and nonprofits and foundations throughout the world. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
So, as a reminder to everybody that's watching today, I am recording this session. I just had to double check that I did hit the record button. I did. I am recording this session. And I'm going to send it out to everybody that registered, within 24 hours of the event. So be on the lookout for an email from me. And if anybody in particular is interested in learning a little bit about MemoryFox, at the very end of our session today, I'm going to do just a quick overview if anybody has any questions for me about MemoryFox. But now I would love to kick it off by passing it over to Anne and Aaron, because one of the questions that I collected during registration, several people wanted to say, can you tell me more about the profound storytelling problem that you all found as part of your report? So I thought it would be great if we just kicked off with a little bit of an overview of your findings.
Sure. That sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everything look good?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes, looks great. And I would be remiss if I didn't start this off by saying that this is work that we did with the Council on Foundations at the Center for Public Interest Communications, and two folks that unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but were so important in sharing and presenting this report are Nicole Bronson from the Council on Foundations and Yu Hao Lee, who is the Director of Research at the Center for Public Interest Communications. And
Sorry,
We
Erin.
want to, no worries. I did the pause thing that would cue. But we want to talk to you today about how you can build trust with better stories. Now, this research came out last year. We were very excited to share it last April. And right before that, there was this report from the Indiana University School of Philanthropy, the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, that looked at what is Americans' relationships with foundations and nonprofits. And this stood out to us in their long list of findings and also in conversation with Chelsea Clark at Indiana University when they asked, have you ever interacted with a nonprofit within the past year? Only 5% of respondents said yes to that question. Now, we all know that that is very much not true. You're interacting with nonprofits and foundations daily, but that really showed us that a lot of people didn't know they were even interacting with these very important parts of their community.
So we also came across this, which we absolutely loved. We thought it was hilarious. We dare you to figure out what our nonprofit does. And as we were reading this, it felt pretty real. It felt like, you know what, this person has actually done a lot of work with nonprofits. And I actually called him up and I was like, did you do a lot of not work with nonprofits? And he said, yes, I spent my career working in nonprofits. And if you haven't seen this piece, it's fabulous. It reminds us that so much of what we say in this sector is absolutely meaningless to the people who are not part of the daily work. And then, of course, there's this. We know that Vice President Vance, JD Vance, has expressed his own concerns about philanthropy and the power that resides in private foundations and their endowments. So we really felt as though this kind of created an important moment for foundations to interrogate the kinds of stories that they were telling and the ways in which they might shift that kind of storytelling to build trust.
And this is really important because we're we're having conversations all the time, and storytelling becomes not it's not just what we're putting on social media or sharing with funders or um, what we're putting in our annual reports. Stories are showing up in conversations we're having across the board, internally in our foundations and externally with policymakers, even. When we will talk more about this later, but we had conversations with some policymakers about what sort of conversations we're seeing. But we also know that in this moment, so much has changed since we released this report, and the attention is shifting. Where are people looking? And it becomes a very big harm that people don't know what we do at every level of the this philanthropic sector, from nonprofits all the way up. Or I should not be using such lateral or vertical metaphors, something that also came up in this report, but this whole environment of philanthropy. We really need to think about what we are communicating in a time where policymakers are giving extra eyes.
So we spent a lot of time looking at, oh, I'm sorry, this is still you.
I think I covered this. I mean, we
You did,
found
you
that
did.
foundations exist in a narrative vacuum. People
Yeah,
don't
absolutely.
know what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And we spent a lot of time sort of establishing this by looking at foundation messaging statements and examining the stories that foundations were telling. And a lot of those were not very good or compelling stories or stories that helped people understand how foundations do their work. And storytelling is the most powerful tool that we have. As communicators, there is no tool that is more compelling, more persuasive, that creates that burning desire to know what happens next. And we know that stories can really help us empathize with people whose lived experience feels very different than our own. And it is the single most powerful tool we have for learning and teaching. I love this quote from Heather McGee. Everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And her book, The Sum of Us, is such a powerful example of helping us re-examine the storytelling context for some of our society's most profound social issues.
So at the start of this project, we wanted to get a sense of what stories were being told, both from foundations, from nonprofits, from policymakers, from the new, like from news media. And we looked at all of this, really trying to get a sense of the narratives, and we categorized them into three separate categories of harmful deep narratives. The first is this distrust of wealth. These are your stories about, oh, philanthropy, it's just rich people trying to come in and um, avoid taxes, that sort of, where did you get your money from? What are you doing? Those stories. We also had the unease with private funds solving public problems. These were a lot of stories about foundations filling the gap, where the government may not be covering things. You have this foundation that is unaccountable to the voters coming in and solving these public problems. There was some stories that were uncomfortable with that. And then the last one is single hero saves the day. These are the stories that are either the rich philanthropist is coming in and dumping a bunch of money in somewhere, or there's this person that is so downtrodden and we came and helped them and now they're able to do this. These stories ignore the larger community, these places of support. They're trying to either make people look like they're using bootstraps or that foundations are nothing more than just banks that bankroll these changes. There's so much more than that. And we do a disservice to our storytelling if we oversimplify how change happens.
So as we looked at the complexity of this communications challenge, we realized that we needed to learn a lot about the challenge and talk to people who were really sort of constructing these narratives, people who are on the receiving end of these narratives, and also really try to listen to the natural conversations that were happening. So we interviewed respected practitioners. We did a survey of communications folks who are working in this sector to understand what kinds of stories they were telling, what their priorities were in storytelling, what they were tracking in terms of their metrics of success. We talked to policymakers and their staff to understand what do they want to hear from foundations? What do they know about them? What kinds of stories have they heard? We did a content analysis of every congressional research report that mentioned foundations or philanthropy. We did social listening to look at what the conversation looks like in the sort of natural environment of policymakers communicating with their constituents in public spaces. And then we did a national survey through which we tested 10 different versions of a story that Aaron rewrote to emphasize 10 different elements to see which elements really built trust.
And we took all of these findings, all the data from these different methodologies, and we categorized them into five or six big insights. The first is that Americans have positive views of philanthropy, but like we showed earlier, they don't really understand the role that it plays. With some notable exceptions and recognizing some shifts that have happened in the past year, members of Congress seem more interested in collaboration with foundations that are close to them. They're the ones that serve their constituents than with regulating foundations. The philanthropic sector has not effectively established a shared narrative to counter harmful narratives about foundations. How many of you have heard, well, when you meet one foundation, you've met one foundation? The same is true with nonprofits. Okay, that's true, but also, what does this look like as a larger sector? Number four, the public, congressional staffers, and practitioners all have said they want foundations to be more transparent and share details about how philanthropy works. Five, jargon and borrowed metaphors obscure the role of foundations in larger systems of change. And six, narrative change and storytelling lack funding for long-term change. We really need to be investing more in that communication effort.
So one of the things I mentioned the 10 versions of a story that Aaron wrote, and one of the things that we saw very clearly is every version of that story increased trust in philanthropy, every single one. But certain stories, like exactly what the funding went to and how that funding led to change, created more trust. So did showing how decisions are made about where that funding was going, which is not something that we get in a lot of stories coming from foundations or nonprofits. Really understanding what's happening behind the scenes, where the ideas are coming from, and how those deliberate choices are made about where the funding should go.
And so what does this look like for you all? How do you use the findings from this report? And if you want to see more charts like that, go read the report. We have a lot. And we also have many, many appendices if you really want to dive into this. But what do you do with this? Well, we want you to tell stories within complex ecosystems. Don't just tell the one person story or a two-person story. Talk about how the community supports each other. We want you to lean into your role as trusted messengers that the public and policymakers have told us that they want to hear from you. You want to commit to sector-wide storytelling, really building those connections with other foundations, other nonprofits. Tell stories that build the right kind of transparency, not just, hey, here's the information in our 990, but this is where the money is going. This is how people are using it. This is why we're doing this. We want you to say what you mean what you say. That means take out the jargon, take out all of that. And we want you to commit the time and resources needed to tell better stories, both at the foundation level and if you're a foundation, supporting nonprofits and doing the same.
And I want to really underscore this point about the importance of real transparency. One of the things that we observed is that foundations are engaging in the appearance of transparency. They're doing the 990s, they're sharing the data about where their funding is going and how big that funding is, but they're not, it's a stack of windows and no house. We don't have the kind of real transparency that helps us connect the dots and really understand the larger narrative about what this sector does. And that matters because if we don't understand how foundations work, and if people don't understand how the sector works, then the sector is out of reach for them and is not available to them as a tool to help them drive positive change. And so
You need to skip the philanthropist speak. I mean, how many of you have seen these terms on the screen? Spin down, on the ground, seat at the table, DAF, RFP, all of these terms and acronyms. Um, there's this really great series in Stanford Social Innovation Review where people were talking about this last year of like, even inside of foundations, people are like, what do these words mean? It helps to be more concrete with what you're trying to say.
yeah, and I think a lot of times when you've got specific expertise, these terms may feel concrete, but they sure don't to the people who don't understand.
Mhm.
And I think Aaron, you were talking before about how the moment in which we're talking about this is different than the moment in which we created it. And I think we've really seen how language that requires a definition for understanding is language that can easily be misunderstood or exploited to mean something that the original author never intended. It's also true that foundations use a lot of scarcity metaphors. They use zero-sum game metaphors where they talk about, a level playing field, or they use a lot of military metaphors like taking point. And those are all great if you have played sports or if you have served, and those terms are really meaningful to you. But all of those reference people fighting over scarce resources and there not being enough to go around.
We actually saw this in our research, this was really interesting to us. Metaphors across the board had similar effects. And what that really said to us is that there's no harm in choosing those abundance metaphors. The metaphors that we tested in this national survey were all metaphors taken from foundations' websites. We did not make these up. They were coming straight from the actual words the sector is already using, from the war and sports metaphors all the way up to the nature and building metaphors. Um, they all worked about the same. So why not lean more towards the ones that are going to talk about abundance, which they have a powerful effect when you're looking outwards, but they also have a powerful effect when you're looking inwards. How are you talking about the work you do? Do you see this as a war, or do you see this as an opportunity to build something new?
So we love this quote from Kamal Sinclair, who said, "A single story is like a star. There are billions in the universe, and each one is a valuable part of our shared reality. A narrative is the way in which we imagine the connections between those stars to draw a constellation, to make meaning and find patterns." And that's what we need to do, is to create a narrative context in which the cumulative effect of telling all of these better stories and using these more effective metaphors and scrubbing that meaningless and potentially harmful jargon from our daily conversations creates the opportunity for us to draw those constellations, and for people to draw this understanding from this really powerful force for change in a new way.
So if you want to apply this work, um, I'm sure Carly will share this link even afterwards. But this QR code will take you to the place where you need to go to get the report, or you can go to cof.org/better-stories, because we really want you to apply this to your work. We want you to be in conversation with us to tell us what works, what doesn't work for you, what have you learned from working with other foundations? And we want to make sure that this continues to build, especially in a time where we really need to do better jobs telling stories.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing because I know there are some questions for us to get to.
Yeah.
To hear
Wow,
that.
thanks for that overview. I feel like you obviously pointed out all like some of the biggest takeaways that I had from the report as well. And it's just so interesting to see all the parallels because like we reached out to Aaron initially being like, oh, you guys are talking about telling better stories. Like our whole slogan here is to tell great stories. Like that's like what we believe in. It's what we help our storytellers do. And specifically when you're talking about like the abundance language versus like the zero sum game language or like the kind of uh the sports language, things that kind of pit people against each other. We talk a lot about strength-based language versus deficit-based language. So just like the parallels are just uh, you know, overflowing over here. But I do have a lot of great questions. Yeah, so we had over 100 questions that were submitted during registration. I pulled, I think, about 10 that I would love to try to get to. We'll see. But I tried to pull ones that I thought kind of represented the whole gamut. So if you're listening right now and you don't hear your exact question, I hope you hear something similar to your question. But let's start with a question from our friend Cynthia. She said, how can organizations communicate its origin story as part of its narrative, and what would that look like? So maybe can you put a lot of examples in the report, but what would that maybe look like if we are a foundation looking to talk about our origin story?
You want to go first, Ann, or do you want me to go?
I have thoughts about origin stories.
Ooh.
I think there are a lot of ways to tell origin stories that can be really, really meaningful, and there are ways to tell origin stories that just feel kind of yucky. So going back to what Aaron was sharing about the three kinds of stories that we saw a lot of, if you're falling into one of those kind of tropes, then an origin story is not going to be very satisfying. It's going to feel very sort of celebratory of a single hero. But I do think there is an opportunity to share an origin story in a way that is focused around the condition that you are trying to address, that really helps people understand the why and to connect it to their moral values and worldviews, to connect it deeply to their sense of right and wrong. And so if you're thinking about why do I need to tell this origin story? Am I telling this origin story because I want to help people understand why we need to take this systems level approach to driving meaningful change on this really complex challenge, and here are some of the people that were involved in all of that and the ecosystem in which that happened? Then I think origin stories can be a really powerful way to apply these principles.
Absolutely. I have two examples that I think could be helpful here. The first one is I can't remember which foundation specifically, but one of their focus areas is on palliative care, the care that you get at the end of life when you need that support and recognition that um, you're nearing the end of life. And this foundation tells a story about how they decided to work in that area because their founder um, experienced the great palliative care that at a local university hospital, which ended up being one of the grantees among other hospitals that got grants for this. But that story was important because it showed why it was so rooted into the values of the foundation. Another example is the Art for Justice Foundation, which is now spent down. Um, but their founder, um, the story behind why she first gave funding to this work or started this foundation was because she watched that movie by Ava DuVernay,
When they see us.
Not When They See Us. It was a different one. I can't remember off the top of my head. Doing a great job telling a story, aren't I? But saw a piece of content, watched a movie that talked about the injustices in the criminal legal system. And she said, I'm going to sell all of my art right now, and we're going to fund this. And her family was like, let's start with one. Let's start with one, really getting focused. And so she sold this painting called Masterpiece, which took the funding from that went to start the foundation, and started this unique style of foundation fundraising of using art as a way to, appreciate funds. And all of that funding went back to fund criminal legal reform work, 100% of the proceeds going to artists, going to criminal justice reform, expanding our understanding of what this was. So those are two stories where those origin stories really do play a huge part in helping us understand why foundations do what they do.
And what I really loved about your first example, Erin, real quick, is that it celebrates a solution. It celebrates the excellence and contributions of other people rather than trying to make a single person or group of people look like a hero.
Yeah, those are great examples. And it's a nice reminder that usually a foundation or a nonprofit, we start doing something because of a story, right? Like there was maybe one family that you helped solve a certain problem that was specific to them, and then you thought, hey, maybe I can make this more streamlined, or I can help this be a long-term solution, or maybe I can offer it to others. And a lot of times those are our own personal experiences that lead us to want to start those nonprofits or expand that program or try something new, expand to a new community. So that's a really good reminder that your origin story can also be a long-term story that can actually form into a series of milestone stories and things that will keep people, engaged again and again. I love that. Um, okay, well, great start. Great start. So let's transition a little bit to a question from our friend Erica. Erica said, what responsibility do funders have in ensuring that their grant making processes do not pressure nonprofits into exploitative storytelling? So you did talk a little bit about some of those pitfalls that you talked about in the report. Exploitative storytelling is something that we're super concerned about here at MemoryFox. Like, I recognize that it's kind of a traditional way that people used to tell stories, but there are a lot of nonprofits that are, transitioning out of that. But such a great question. So what would you say might be the responsibility for funders to kind of maybe stop that or not put pressure on nonprofits?
I mean, that's hugely important. It's kind of central to the work of this report. Um, and it really is baked into how this work has been done for decades. And it actually came up in our interviews. We were speaking to someone that worked at a foundation, and they mentioned that they had tried so hard to get nonprofits to not try and tell exploitative stories or stories that were like, we're so thankful to so and so foundation because their life-changing funding helped us do this. Like, this foundation was trying hard to stop that process. And so it is simultaneously a responsibility of the foundation to say, hey, we don't want to paint this as a a non-solvable problem
Right.
of like severe issues. There are solutions, and there's also this level of relationship building that needs to happen with nonprofits, reminding them like, hey, we are working with you. We want you to tell stories. We want to know how this is actually happening, not feeling effusively like you're the best thing ever. Like,
Right.
that is not what we want in this process. And that also requires you to look in. What is your reporting structure at your foundation? Like, are you asking for stories that are non-exploitative, or are you leaving it open? You can be more prescriptive with that. And also talk to other foundations. Say, hey, what are you doing? Because our shared grantee is still telling these stories because they think that's what we want, but that's not what we want. This really shows how this is a sector-wide process that we should be working together. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Anne.
No. Um, yeah, I think, wow, such a good point. It really does come down to once, if I might try to take your answer and put it back at you. Sort of sounds like you're saying it kind of comes down to just being deciding on your values, being upfront about your values and letting
Mhm.
your grantees know or potential grantees know, like, this is an important value for us. We want to help you or make sure that you feel like you are being heard without feeling like you need to tell me your saddest story or sensationalize a sad story that has happened, and that won't be hinging on if you're going to get funding or not. Some kind of sometimes there's kind of this power imbalance that or maybe a perceived power imbalance that maybe
Mhm.
doesn't exist anymore, but that people get really nervous, like they feel like they need to demonstrate how big or massive a need might be. And they can do that with exploitative storytelling.
I
So,
think those power imbalances are still there. I think they're very much there. And I think it really starts with foundations and the nonprofits and communities that they're working with, really building a culture in their relationship that
yeah,
says, we're all bringing something here. You're bringing expertise. You're bringing lived experience. You're bringing the know-how to address this. You're bringing money. And that each of those things are an essential piece. It's not that no problem has a price tag, right?
right.
We need all of these things coming together.
That's such a good point. I love that. Great clarification. Um, Well, great. I will also remind our audience, if anybody has any questions in real time, you can go ahead and drop those in the chat and we'd love to discuss those live as well. But moving right along, I have a couple questions that I thought fit nicely together kind of in a combo. So here's sort of part one, and this comes from Kim. Kim said, grant makers are often one step removed from the direct impact on the lives of individuals served by the nonprofit organization receiving the grant. right? How can grant makers share their impact while not claiming the success stories of the nonprofits that they grant? So that's a kind of a longer way to say, how do we, how can the grant makers feel like they are contributing, of course, to the success, but they are not owning all of the success? And then kind of a combo might be our question we got from our friend Kate, where she said, how do we ensure the companies we submit proposals to or send reports to ethically share our stories? So not even just how do we make sure they're not kind of owning the stories, but how do we make sure that they're then using the stuff that we give to them and sharing that ethically as well? That's kind of two-sided, but any thoughts on that dynamic?
Just speaking to the first one, I think that if you can, as a program officer or communications officer, if you have the opportunity to really get into the field, spend time doing those site visits, not to be the person sitting at the head of the table asking all the questions, but the person who is tagging along and observing and really understanding how these programs work, listening to people in the community describe the difference the program is making, then you can bring those stories back and cheerlead for these programs, because no one foundation is going to be able to give all the funding that programs that really take on wicked problems in meaningful ways need to keep going. So you can talk about how amazing these programs are. You don't have to talk about like you created it. You can talk about it as its evolution, and you can be reaching out to other funders to tell the stories of the great work that the grantees are doing and these communities are doing. And so I think it's really the more that you have the opportunity to really spend the time with the grantees, understanding the work, championing the work, the better the better you're going to be able to be to resist kind of taking that ownership of it. What was the second part of your question,
Oh,
Carla? I'm
no.
sorry.
And then kind of the second part would just be, and then once they do kind of maybe understand those stories, or maybe they're collected in a report or something, how can we be sure that they will share those stories ethically after we've kind of given them to them?
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
It is. And I think it goes back to the relationship side of things. Um, we've talked about how foundations have a relationship and maybe like saying, hey, you should be doing it this way. The other side of this, nonprofits are building a relationship as well. You'll get a sense of what their storytelling is like. You can express your values in that moment, recognizing that there is a power imbalance, but like finding maybe a moment through relationship building to kind of push back on it. But ultimately, you should only share stories that you have sourced ethically. You can make a decision about what sort of stories go to the company or the foundation. Kind of restrict the stories that you share up or you share out um, to ones that you know that you've sourced ethically, that the storyteller themselves is comfortable, knows exactly how it's been told, feels comfortable telling that story. Make sure that you have all of those pieces of ethical storytelling first, and then share it forward. Um, be mindful. And I mean, these stories are kind of like, um, these are very personal. They're very special to people. And you can treat them kind of like special, precious um, things that you want to make sure are properly stewarded. That's actually kind of why I really like the MemoryFox tool, that level of consent and level of value given to the storyteller themselves, that they have the agency to say, hey, actually I changed my mind.
Right.
Having that relationship and having that access makes MemoryFox such a fabulous tool for this. And it helps, I think, nonprofits know, okay, I can feel good sharing this one,
Right.
and maybe this one needs some more time, more conversation, more support.
Well, I did not pay him to say that, so.
I know I plan to drop it in there.
No, I think it's Yeah, there's so many aspects to ethically collecting a story, which inherently makes it more ethically shared when you are able to kind of get those things out of the way up front. Um, for example, we work with a lot of storytellers that will have different consent forms, and one will be, you know, this one is stories that we're collecting for grant reports, and we know grant reports, maybe they know from their grant reporting history, these grant reports are only shared, within this circle of people, and there's an understanding that it will not be publicly shared. So yeah, that's kind of like an option where somebody might feel more comfortable sharing different parts of their story if they know it won't be publicly shared. So just something to consider. Um, any other thoughts on this combo question? All right.
Hmm.
Well, the next question that came up, actually, we have already touched on a little bit, but we would love to dig a little deeper. And this comes from Gwen. Gwen said, can ethical storytelling shift the power but dynamics between foundations and grantees? And if so, how? So committing to telling story, collecting stories, telling stories ethically, how could that impact the power dynamics that we've maybe previously seen?
I think it starts with really thinking about who the protagonist of the story is. Because I think a lot of times, if you are going to be really intentional in choosing who is this story about and how does this person want to tell their story and how do they want to be represented in that story? I think that really when you tell stories in that way, we start seeing people in different ways. And, organizations, for example, that are working with people who are unhoused, really talking about, the experiences of, I think we've really seen this shift of what are people's hopes and dreams? What are the things that are getting in the way of their hopes and dreams? Really kind of focusing on how what's important to those individuals. And then when we start telling stories in that way, we understand the people who are in the stories in different ways. We see the groups of people that we've dedicated ourselves to serving in different ways. And I think that that's really important.
There's something that we talked about like while during the project, and Anne, you and Nicole actually would say this like amazingly every time. I'm gonna butcher it. So if you want to jump in and save me, you can. But this idea that storytelling can shift how we can perceive the work. Storytelling is not just for um, showing progress or showing like this is what we're doing with X, Y, and Z, but we really we have this hypothesis that if we change how we tell stories, we might also change how we work at every level. Like um, if I'm thinking about how we tell stories differently, like if I'm changing from this view of it being like front lines, war focused to community building and communities going and working together, that might change how I look at funding. And I also change how I view the work that I'm doing as well. So I think the answer to that question is like, yes. I think that ethical storytelling can really shift the power dynamics, but also just how we view the work.
Absolutely. You have just reminded me of some good advice that I got a few years ago, when I wrote the first, with the 2023 Ethical Storytelling Report. We had a contributor that made a really good point of when we think about framing our storytelling, kind of maybe again, kind of a traditional, maybe exploitative way might be to other somebody or other the people that we're serving. But it's actually can feel a lot more powerful if you're instead talking about the things that we all have in common. And the example was, if I was maybe a donor, somebody that they're looking to donate to a food bank, for example, maybe I don't personally know the feeling of waiting in a line or waiting for services, But what I do know, and what a lot of people do know, is the experience of having a meal that makes you feel like a closer family, or makes you get a chance to celebrate each other or tell stories around a dinner table. And maybe if we think about framing things in a way where everyone could get to experience something that we hold dear to us, instead of othering them by saying these are things that, they've, just kind of in a more of a deficit framed way.
Mhm.
I thought that was such a great way to really kind of tell the same exact story, but really the opposite way.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that we saw from other work that we did, focused on guaranteed income in
Right.
Massachusetts. One thing that really stood out to us, and we tested, and it stood out there as well, is that people really resonate with this idea of choices. When they hear guaranteed income, sometimes they're like, oh, you're just giving people handouts and stuff like this. However, in a time where a lot of taxes were shifting in, what was it called? Inflation was on the rise last year when we were doing this. People really resonated with this idea of, oh, my money is getting tighter, my pocketbook is getting tighter, and I'm having to make choices. That recognition of choices and the constraints that money could have really helped people better understand, like, oh, yeah, we should be supportive of this because people are really
Hmm.
feeling their ability to make a choice change. So, similar in like having the food with family, our shared experience of
Hmm.
choices, our shared experiences of being American, those all those different things can um, play together.
I love that. That's a really good example. Wonderful. Well, let's move on. I have a question here from Laura. Laura said, if someone is willing to share their story but not their photo, and the funder requests photos in their report, what would you think would be a nice option for that? What's a nice kind of workaround for something like that? Like if a photo is required.
Well, first, I want to know who's requiring photos.
I know, right?
I'm really struggling with that because I feel like that's such a clear place to push back, especially when you're working with people who for a range of reasons. And I think this is something that we really think a lot about with ethical storytelling is that in a moment when everything lives forever, being really kind of thoughtful about what are you asking for? I remember one day when we're at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and we were telling the story of this really great program that the foundation had um, learned about and invested in around making sure that young people who entered into the criminal justice system through through substance use disorders had the opportunity, instead of going to and becoming incarcerated, to get treatment instead. And it's a really amazing to see the ways in which this program really kept families together and uh, instead of being destructive was constructive. And there is the story of that we had created just for our board of trustees, no one else. And it was the story of this young woman who had been faced with some really challenging choices and was in recovery and was talking about what it meant to be in recovery. And at one point, we just turned to each other and said, this is an amazing, amazing story. She is extraordinary, but it's not right. We cannot share this with our board of trustees. And there was some pushback around like, well, it's just for this room. But we ultimately decided like we are in a moment where this kind of material lives on forever. And we
Mhm.
ultimately decided to destroy it and not to tell the story in that way.
That is so that is so important in choosing how you use those stories. Um, if I could add just a few more things about like what to do in that scenario,
Yeah.
don't use stock photos because one, that is not truthful. That is giving that some person's story to someone else. And we only deal with the truth here. And two, those people that were in the photo, the stock photo, signed up to be in a stock photo. They did not sign up to be the face of whatever this is. So think about, okay, this is an actual person's face. I would recommend pushing back on the foundation that's asking for it. Or if you're on the foundation side, thinking about, okay, this is something where somebody doesn't want to share a photo. If we are going to use this, maybe hiring an artist or a graphic designer to make some sort of artistic representation of this. You'll see this in like news articles. They'll
Mhm.
sometimes bring in someone to do this. I would not recommend using AI to do this because AI is trained on the data that is on the internet,
Right.
and it might perpetuate some of those stereotypes. There's like a
Well,
really strong issue with bias there.
and that would
With
contribute to an increased undermining of trust as well if those images, when people find out those images aren't real. Sorry.
Definitely.
Exactly. So if you're going to use like AI does not have the ability to fact check itself or to go back and say like this is good or this is not. AI can do like a lot of really wonderful things in terms of making something, but you still need to like check it. And so to just cut that out of the loop, if you want to use AI for other things, great. Don't use AI to create fictitious people to be the face of a
One
story
thing,
that, yeah.
one thing that I've seen some storytellers do really, really well is just if you're using video, creating your video from the point of view of the person whose story you're telling. So you don't ever see them. You only see what
Ooh,
they see in the experience.
I like that.
Yeah, I love that. We talk a lot about different ways to share stories while keeping the storyteller anonymous. There's quite a few strategies to it. Like you're saying, you could tell the story from another perspective. You could tell the story from the from the program manager, maybe from somebody else who has works for you, like a staff member. You could tell a story of, we have this great example in our report about kind of shifting the story to being about maybe an object in the story instead of the actual storyteller. So maybe it's the actual food truck that's making the deliveries, or it's about the brown paper bag that's serving the nutritious lunches, or it's about the hammer that's building the homes. There's a lot of things you can do. And of course, I know this question, we're kind of specifically talking about photos. I would say you could use a stock photo of a hammer. That would be fine with me. But I agree that when you are, we don't want to be putting, if if there is a situation where you do feel like you do need to use a stock photo, it should be like abundantly clear that this is not a real
Mhm.
representation. So, yeah, there's a lot of options there. But I actually really love what you said, Aaron, about if you are somebody listening today and you're in the foundation's position where you're the one kind of with a little bit of uh, editing power, maybe you can make some policy changes at your foundation and say, hey, we would love a photo, but we understand that in some situations it doesn't make sense. Or maybe you could follow up if there is another opportunity later for storytelling, something like that would be great. Well, let's see. We have zoomed right along here. We are, let's see, about less than 10 minutes left. So, what I want to do is I want to ask a wrap-up question that we can kind of get some final thoughts out there. And my question, I ask this at the end of all of my Ask Me Anything events. But really, I just want to say, can you both share one final takeaway with our audience today? So, this could be something that you want to reiterate that you've already spoken about, or maybe it's something completely new that we just didn't get a chance to talk about. So, I don't know, Erin, would you like to start?
Sure. Um, I have like two things. One's like super short,
I
and the other
said
one
one. No, I'm
is
just
great.
kidding. I'll take two.
Well, I feel like a lot of people ask us, like, okay, who's was an example of someone doing this well? I would like to shout out the Stepsky Foundation. They do a great job of storytelling. They're a spin down foundation based in the Bay Area of California. Highly recommend their work. Their communication director, Claire Callahan, is phenomenal. Um, the big takeaway that we haven't talked about is kind of talked about, but that this is a sector-wide effort. Something that's really showing up now across our country is like focusing on singling out individual foundations or individual universities and making this like an individual problem.
Yeah, we hear about
Because it's,
a new one every day that we're
yeah,
singling out. Yeah.
oh, yeah. And we can't fall into that kind of space. Like we each do very individual, important things, but we're part of a larger sector, and we're stronger together. We can tell stories, we can learn from each other, telling the story about how philanthropy works, um, not just what your foundation do, but how foundations work, telling a story with another foundation. Um, that's hugely important right now. Like really relying on each other, is,
That's a
you know,
wonderful takeaway. I'm so glad you said that. Thank you. And what do you think? Final takeaway, something we haven't talked about or something you'd like to reiterate for our audience?
Yeah, for sure. And I've worked in the philanthropic sector for a really long time. And one of the things that I observed is that people in the philanthropic sector, and I think this is more true now even than it was, 10 years ago, is that people who are working in philanthropy are very distrustful of people who are kind of outside of that world. And so they tend to keep a lot of those details that would help others understand and trust them very close to the vest because they're concerned about being overwhelmed by requests, or they're concerned about their private information becoming available. And I remember when we, started redesigning websites and people were, didn't want to put their email addresses on the website because they were afraid
Right, yes.
to be inundated. And I think that that's part of the reason that foundations are so hesitant to really show what philanthropy looks like and what the work really looks like. But I think there's so much to be gained, not just for individual foundations, not even just for the sector, but for society overall. I think a lot of good comes from telling accurate, transparent, compelling stories about how change really happens, including all of those mundane details, the tiny choices along the way, all of the person who made the copies and put the chairs out, and maybe some of that funding went to buy donuts. I think all of those things help to build understanding and trust, and how hard it really is to really build the world we wish existed.
Wow, that is such a good point, right? I mean, I'm sure we have all thought about this before, but I always think it's so interesting that kind of in the philanthropic world, like if we end up performing our mission perfectly, we put ourselves out of business, right? Like that, and that's kind of like what we want to do, right? We want to like solve a problem. We want to like provide a long-term solution. And but it is kind of ironic because that would, theoretically put yourself out of business if you end up being super successful. So I don't know if that's a inspirational way to wrap up or not, but I feel like we're all trying to do good work out here and everybody um especially the nonprofits that I know, a lot of nonprofits are really shifting to ethical storytelling. They're really shifting to that more community-based approach with their grantee or with their grant makers, with their funders. So this has been a really wonderful conversation. I feel like I learned a lot. I hope everybody else did. Thank you all for joining me. And again, sorry that we had to reschedule, but of course, a little bit out of, I wasn't it was out of my control for having to do the rescheduling, but still, sometimes Zoom doesn't work well for all of us, but most of the time it does, and we love Zoom. But thank you all so much.
Thank
Now,
you.
I would
thank
just
you.
Yay, yeah. I would love to have, if you haven't downloaded the report, definitely get it, take a look at it. I know there's a section of the report where you can, like Aaron was saying earlier, you can have a conversation, provide some feedback. If you have some resources that you think should be added to, I think one of the appendixes is like a resource section. You can, submit something to be added to that. Like this is something where we're all learning together. So yes, definitely get a coffee. Thank you so much for joining me today. I feel like this has been such a special event, and we are so lucky to be able to host you.
Oh, thanks,
So thank
Carly.
you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining. It was really exciting to have this opportunity.
And then, like I said at the top of the hour, if anybody does want to stick around and learn just a little bit about MemoryFox, I'm going to do a quick overview for you. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Of course, it will take me just a moment. And like I did say before, I will also be sending out the recording. So everyone will be getting the recording. Okay. going to do this and share my screen. All right. Wonderful. So, if you're not familiar with what MemoryFox does, we kind of always like to start off with this premise that, great storytelling does kind of start with your mission, or we talked a little bit about origin stories today, but it kind of starts with this idea of if somebody asks you what is your mission, are you able to show them? And we've actually found that a lot of people say no. And we're wondering, if you think that you fall into that no category, then, what's stopping you? When we talk to nonprofit professionals, we find that they kind of fall into one of these four categories. Number one, collecting content from our community is like pulling teeth. Number two, organizing content can be frustrating and very time consuming. Number three, we need a more efficient and modern way to share our story. Or number four, I struggle with collecting community stories ethically. So we actually built MemoryFox to specifically hit on all these pain points. So it's set up in a three-step system of collect, organizing, and sharing. And we also recognize that nonprofits like you have been given the impossible task of competing in the attention economy while also remaining true to ethical standards. So you are held to much higher standards than for-profit companies surrounding you, and you have a lot more barriers to getting your message out there. In fact, in the 2023 Ethical Storytelling Report, we found that 58% of nonprofit professionals said that they actually struggle with wanting to collect stories from their community while doing no harm. So this is a big thing that people are trying to address. But quick overview of how MemoryFox actually works. So in terms of collection, we help you build story collection campaigns that are branded to your organization and you distribute directly to your community. They go through a few steps that includes getting consent up front, and they are able to submit a video, photo, or written testimonial directly to your organization, and it will populate in your story bank. If anybody does want to see how the process works, you're welcome to scan that QR code and you can submit a pet photo or a landscape photo, and you can see what the story collection process really is like. But once a submission is made to MemoryFox, it does populate in your MemoryFox story bank. So this is available to everyone that works at your organization as your back-end support of where all your stories can live. When you're in your story bank, you're able to tag your content by program, by event, by department, really whatever makes the most sense for you. You also are able to bulk upload all of your existing content, so you don't have to start at zero. You can start with everything you have. And we love to offer unlimited storage. You are not blocked by how many stories you can collect, and that's really because we believe that you should be able to collect stories all year long in every way that makes sense for you, so you have as many options as possible. And then in terms of sharing, we have a lot of tools that help you share your stories more easily. So, for example, you can see here we are integrated with Canva. And what that means is that when you collect a photo or a video from through the story collection tool, it will automatically populate in your Canva account. So you can simply drag and drop it into your branded templates that you already love to use. We also have a story builder where you can create a web page, an embeddable web page that actually can display several stories in one place so people can click through photos or they can click through a bunch of videos and see a series of videos in a row. And the thing that I also really love about our share feature is that you can always download the high quality original submission. So that's really important because sometimes you might get a photo through an email, you might get a photo through a text message, something like that. And then of course it comes as a thumbnail and it's not easy to use or it's something that's blurry. And this really just gets over that whole process of the download, upload, re-upload process. And as you probably heard in today's session, we are uniquely focused on ethical storytelling. So MemoryFox is the #1 ethical storytelling technology tool for nonprofits. Some of our features that we offer, which make us the #1 ethical storytelling tool, include our equitable pricing model. So our pricing is based on the revenue that you have, the amount of employees that you have, the amount of volunteers you have. We really feel like every nonprofit has great stories to tell, so we want to help you find a way to do it. We talked about consent earlier today, and MemoryFox, there's a built-in editable consent form that people must submit that they agree to before they even submit a story, but people also are able to remove their consent at any time. We also have privacy, which means that MemoryFox never owns your content. It is completely your content and your stories to collect and share how you would like to use them. In terms of accessibility, the way that our platform works, you can share stories. Your storytellers are able to use their own devices to share their stories when and where they are most comfortable. And everything about MemoryFox is customizable. So that means that you can use your community's strength-based language to prompt them to give the stories that you're looking for, but also just to address them in the way that is the strength-based way. So that is a super quick overview. I know that we're talking about foundational storytelling today, so I also wanted to let you know that we do have a unique dual potential when it comes to working with foundations. So what I mean by that is if a foundation wants to become a MemoryFox storyteller and they would like to also have their grantees brought into MemoryFox to use as well, there are ways that we have built the system where you can help them collect their own stories and they can easily share them with you in both directions. So that's a really fun way that you can make storytelling fun from the foundation side extra simple. All right, so just to wrap up, I know that was super quick. If anybody does want to book a time with one of our MemoryFox storytellers, you can book a time here, and you can check us out to learn more about your ethical storytelling goals and get your impact storytelling plan. Or next week, we're going to have a community demo. I'm actually going to invite all of you um, uh, via calendar invite, so be on the lookout of that from me. But yeah, I'd love to see you at next week's community demo, and we'll talk a little bit more about all of things MemoryFox. So that's that. I'm going to wrap up now. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for staying on. What a wonderful chat, and thank you for believing in ethical storytelling.